In this episode of the Shawn-Ryan Show, the host and guest Andrew Bustamante discuss the China threat and its potential to become the next global superpower. They start by talking about the recent controversy surrounding the lab leak theory of the COVID-19 pandemic, which suggests that the virus may have originated in a lab in China. The Department of Energy conducted a study and made a statement that was later misinterpreted by the media. Bustamante explains that while there is not enough evidence to confirm or deny the lab leak theory, the government's inadequate communication has led to a lot of speculation and conspiracy theories. They highlight how the media can twist information and create confusion, and how this can hinder efforts to address important global issues. They suggest that countries like China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran heavily invest in shaping American politics, not necessarily to influence a specific outcome, but to cause chaos and division. Bustamante explains that covert influence is a core fundamental belief in causing chaos and division through disinformation, which can take root in false information. They provide an example of the alleged Chinese spy balloon that was shot down over Montana, which caused panic among the American public, but it turned out to be a false alarm. They also discuss how the government and military use deliberate misinformation to control the information flow to the media and public, particularly in the case of UFOs or unidentified flying objects. They explain how the government prefers to use less alarmist terms like UFO rather than balloons, which can draw too much attention and result in an international incident, such as the case of a Chinese spy balloon. However, using the term UFO can lead to confusion and misinterpretation, as was the case when 2 more balloons were shot down and labeled UFOs. The government overclassifies information and sometimes even intentionally seeds misinformation to benefit national security. Additionally, Bustamante discusses how balloons are often used for spying due to their long loiter time and ability to move with predominant winds, making them difficult to detect. Iran, Russia, China, and other countries likely use balloons for this purpose. Andrew suggests that the people who believe that the spy balloon was only collecting imagery are naive and unaware of the capabilities that such technology possesses. He states that the spy balloon could have been equipped with solar panels for power, directional and wide-spectrum signal dishes for collecting and transmitting information, as well as potential relays for transmitting the collected data back to China. Andrew also briefly explains the concept of quantum entanglement, which the Chinese government claims to use to communicate with its satellites, but he expresses skepticism about its effectiveness. Quantum entanglement involves manipulating particles in such a way that one half of the particle will replicate any changes made to the other half, no matter how far apart they are in space. This means that communication through quantum entanglement cannot be intercepted or jammed. While some articles discuss this concept, the extent of China's use of quantum entanglement for communication is unknown. However, according to a recent report by the U.S. State Department, China is ahead of the United States in 33 out of 41 critical next-generation technologies, including advanced communication and artificial intelligence. Additionally, the Chinese government requires any new tech developed by foreign companies in China to be shared with the government, potentially giving them an advantage in these technologies. The discussion then moves on to how China's influence and involvement in the tech industry could impact the division within the United States, especially in relation to topics such as woke culture and ESG practices. According to Bustamante, ESG is beneficial economically as it brings more diversity, appreciation of different cultures and races, and companies are getting paid more money. However, woke culture is seen as a drain on resources and does not add any value. The Chinese are believed to be using the divisive topic of woke culture to spread their influence covertly. Social media platforms like TikTok, which is controlled by China, provide a way to shape and cultivate conflicts by creating specific algorithms targeted at certain demographics. Mainstream media, Google search, and magazines are also mentioned as potential avenues for paid content that can be tailored and targeted to specific audiences, and the Chinese are said to be involved in many initiatives that could have important implications for the world. The most concerning issue, according to Bustamante, is that China has the potential to direct next steps in Europe and could gain power through its involvement in initiatives such as hypersonic missiles, Huawei, rare earth minerals, and the Belt Road Initiative. They talk about the dangers of relying on China for essential goods like medical supplies and green energy technology, and the tendency of Western countries to turn a blind eye to China's human rights violations and political agenda in exchange for economic benefits. They also discuss the lack of measures being taken to counter China's growing influence, such as the continued import of Chinese-made products despite political tensions. However, they also mention that there are policies in place, particularly by the previous Trump administration, that are anti-China, but are currently being revised under the Biden administration. Overall, they emphasize the need for people to pay attention to developments related to China, rather than getting caught up in distractions like mainstream media and pop culture. They discuss the issue of political infighting, which distracts us from focusing on larger questions and issues that pose a threat to our children and future generations. They also discuss the threat of electromagnetic pulses, which are created from violent explosions and are also the byproduct of a nuclear detonation. The two types of EMPs can cause widespread damage to communication devices, fuses, and software that lie within their reach. The intensity and reach of an EMP depend on the altitude and yield of the weapon. Cyber warfare will likely be used to jam signals followed by an EMP blast, which would destroy the software and hardware of the targets. Low-yield nuclear weapons can also be delivered in vehicles to create a localized EMP with no identifying signs of a nuclear blast. In the event of an EMP, there would be no vehicles. They explain that an EMP attack could potentially neutralize all modern technology and communication systems containing smart chips, such as cell phones and Tesla cars, while older technologies such as an old-school Chevelle would still work. They also discuss the possibility of a cyber attack being used to neutralize the United States' ability to identify and defend against an incoming EMP attack. While an EMP attack is unlikely to affect military bases due to their shielding mechanisms, it could very well affect the civilian population, causing problems such as a lack of electricity, food, water, and heat. However, they also discuss the idea that a common enemy could bring people together and unite them, citing the example of how Americans came together after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. The conversation also touches upon the administration's role in promoting or hindering unity, with the Biden administration seemingly wising up to the fact that Russia is not the United States' true common enemy. Bustamante argues that the American administration is realizing the threat China poses to their long-term role as a superpower, and that this may lead to both sides of the aisle supporting Ukraine as an economic benefit. He notes that just a few years ago, criticizing China would have resulted in accusations of racism, but now it is an accepted topic of conversation. The conversation then shifts to the weaponization of space and the START treaty between the US and Russia that was put in place to limit and downsize the number of nuclear weapons. This treaty is set to expire in 2025, but Putin recently announced that he will not renew it. Bustamante explains that the non-weaponization of space treaty has been in place since the 70s, but there are now many more countries and commercial entities putting things into space that were not part of the original treaty. This opens the door to the possibility of weaponizing space with smart weapons, energy-directed weapons, laser weapons, and explosive devices. Bustamante notes that he is not aware of any country currently putting weapons into space, but there are at least 25 to 30 countries with the infrastructure to launch satellites and vehicles into space. He also mentions that there are some countries with a grudge against others who may consider putting a weapon into space, such as Pakistan, India, Turkey, Iran, and North Korea. The conversation then touches on the importance of understanding the language used by intelligence agencies when communicating with one another. They explain that terms like likelihood and confidence are used in a structured manner to convey the probability of certain events or information being accurate. However, the media often misinterprets these terms and creates misleading headlines. The discussion then shifts to the question of whether the COVID-19 virus originated in a lab in China, and whether this could be considered an act of war. The guest argues that it is unlikely to be an act of war, as the Chinese have a vastly different cultural mindset to Americans, which centers on protecting family honor and the idea of China being the center kingdom. These cultural factors influence China's consolidation of resources and desire to be a superpower, which differ significantly from the American desire to promote individualism and break the wheel of centralized power. Then the topic of government secrecy and potentially falsifying an alien invasion is discussed. Andrew Bustamante explains that the reason people are fixated on UFOs is that human beings don't like an open loop in their reasoning process and want closure. The open loop in this case is the mystery of what's in the sky that we can't identify. This leads people to theorize about what it could be to try to close the cognitive loop. The fixation on aliens, on the other hand, is related to human mortality. The closer we get to death, the more intense our questions become about life after death, whether there is more after death, or if we are just a pile of functioning biological systems that will turn into dust. The question of whether there is life outside of Earth, and the possibility of advanced technology that could help us prolong our lives drives our fixation with alien life. The government released the UAP report 2 years ago, and also made these two open loops more mainstream. The government admitted to collecting information about UFOs and UAPs since the 1950s, lent credibility to these mysteries and made it so that people could openly discuss and speculate without being called crazy. There is real evidence that speaks to the unidentified aerial phenomena and things in the sky that nobody can describe, such as the footage from the 2007 Nimitz and F-18s tracking multiple aerial vehicles that they couldn't define. Andrew Bustamante also mentions that he has a theory on what these phenomena could be due to his work on an unnamed television show. The show is an investigation into potential government cover-ups and secrets that could explain some of these phenomena. He describes his own experiences of seeing strange lights in the sky, including triangle patterns and lights that jump from place to place. He suggests that the Southwest, particularly in the skies above Nevada, Arizona, and Colorado, is a concentrated area where such strange occurrences are reported. The host acknowledges that there may be classified information that the government is not sharing with the public, as well as real national security concerns related to new weapons and aircraft technology that must be protected. However, he argues that there are also empty holes in our understanding of these phenomena and that there may be natural explanations for some of the lights witnessed in the sky, such as ball lightning and electromagnetic energy in the atmosphere related to geological events. The host emphasizes that many people are seeing strange things in the sky, but there is a lack of information available to understand what they are. There is a distinction made between unidentified aerial phenomena and known aerial phenomena, as well as a natural phenomena like ball lightning. Bustamante explains that there is a connection between the geology of a location, the energetics of that location, and how they impact UAPs and UFOs. He discusses how areas heavy in metals like iron ore, copper ore, and quartz create an environment where the molten core of the Earth can charge an artificial or natural battery. The energy stored in the quartz is released to the surface through the quartz, creating higher electromagnetic energy fields. The city of Sedona, Arizona is given as an example of this phenomenon, and Bustamante emphasizes that this location is unique specifically because of its ability to capture and store energy from the core of the Earth. People report seeing lots of strange UFO sightings and energy vortexes in parts of Sedona. Bustamante suggests that perhaps it is worth looking underground first before considering life at altitude. He highlights the fact that wonders of the world like the pyramids, Stonehenge, and Machu Picchu are all located on fault lines, which bring a certain frequency and vibration, as well as a crack in the crust that would allow energy to come out. They mention that Machu Picchu and the pyramids are connected along a certain belt around the world. This leads to questions about the origins of life on Earth, and whether it was intelligently designed by a higher being or if there is some kind of ancient civilization that had traveled to these different locations. However, they acknowledge that these are just theories and there is no concrete evidence to support them. They then discuss the possibility of coronavirus being an act of war by China. Andrew Bustamante gives 3 reasons why he does not believe it to be an intentional act of war. Firstly, China's strategic MO is to do things quietly, not loud and noisy like the coronavirus outbreak. Secondly, China has a history of unsanitary experimental conditions where novel natural viruses are born and spread, as demonstrated by the outbreaks of bird flu, swine flu, and other novel viruses originating in China. Finally, China will pull the trigger when they want something, as it did in Hong Kong, and it will be a decisive and fast action, backed by multiple support efforts, unlike the handling of COVID-19. Despite the possibility of China developing biological weapons or defense, there is no evidence to support it, and taking into account all the data, Andrew Bustamante does not believe that COVID-19 was an act of war by China. They suggest that once COVID-19 hit the democratic world, individuals became preoccupied with counting sick people, beds, and deaths, without proper context or research. The Democratic Party was panicked by the pandemic, whereas Republicans were initially told to not panic. The pandemic became a political issue during the election year, leading to President Biden pouring money into vaccines and pushing for a vaccine mandate for government employees. Moreover, Bustamante notes the growing concern for the devaluation of the US dollar due to inflation, high interest rates, and Congress spending excessive amounts of money, leading to the devaluation of the US dollar. He urges individuals to consider investing in precious metals, such as gold and silver, to protect their savings and retirement against inflation and recession. Shawn-Ryan and Andrew Bustamante discuss the United States government's response to the coronavirus pandemic and how other first world countries followed the US lead. The guest suggests that the government cannot admit its mistakes and must focus the American public on something else. The guest argues that China's actions were an overreaction by US standards, but it was typical of a surveillance police state. They also consider the possibility that COVID-19 was a population control move for China, but the probability of that being intentional is low. However, Bustamante does believe that COVID-19 pulled back the veil on China's supply chain management, control of movement, and human rights abuses. Andrew Bustamante, the guest on the show, highlights how China is building massive infrastructure in Africa, such as 4-lane highways and skyscrapers, to acquire natural resources from the continent. China is also buying lithium mines in Mexico and Afghanistan as part of the BRI, which Xi Jinping initiated in 2017. The initiative aims to put China at the center of a supply chain and resource belt that spans the world, allowing China to import raw materials and export finished products. This provides China with economic benefits as well as soft power or influence in third-world countries. Bustamante explains that China is an autocracy and does not need majority votes or approval from anyone to conduct business with any country, especially poor, poverty-stricken, and corrupt third-world countries, which is where most of the BRI projects are located. China leases raw materials and locations and builds infrastructure while taking Chinese employees to work in these countries. This creates an opportunity for China to influence and build relationships with these countries towards its favor. China recently built 10 military bases globally, which they call airports, and countries lease the land to China for its own purposes. As Bustamante notes, China moves slow but wins comprehensively. The conversation shifts towards how China is also settling and getting strategic points all over the world. The US and Europe are initiating a green initiative, but China, which moves slowly, is looking to be the sole provider of batteries that power all the solar equipment for green energy. China is also buying all of the lithium mines for batteries that make panels, wind turbines, and other green energy components. The US is dependent on China for these components, despite having initiated a green energy initiative. The conversation points out the hypocrisy of criticizing Europe for getting their energy from Russia, which is seen as an enemy, while the US is getting its energy from China. It is unclear why the US is not shifting its focus to become energy independent, instead of being dependent on China, which is also its adversary. The Obama administration's Asia pivot policy aimed to shift focus from counterterrorism to China, but the country became more polarized, leading to a lack of consensus and follow-through on this strategic threat. This is a concern for the next generation as China poses the biggest threat to the country's future. The conversation also touched on the fentanyl crisis and the role of organized crime in autocratic nations such as China. The guest suggested that organized crime in democracies must operate under multiple layers of police enforcement, making large operations and money movements difficult. However, in autocracies, they only need to bypass one main governing agent, which makes it easier for them to operate. The presence of Chinese scientists and individuals supporting the drug trade in South America suggested more of a criminal effort than an organized state effort. If it were an organized state effort, they would have used cutout nations in between to conceal their involvement. Bustamante notes that if the Chinese government was involved in criminal activity, they would put layers in place to protect their involvement and give themselves plausible deniability. He compares this to running an underground criminal network, where layers are put in place to protect those involved. However, he notes that current events don't seem to be a mature operation and sound more like a criminal operation. The discussion then shifts to the reliability of journalism and the spread of speculative accusations in the media. Bustamante notes that journalistic principles are not being applied rigorously and headlines often don't match the content of the article. Additionally, he states that digital news providers are starting to apply proper journalistic practices more rigorously because they can easily update their content. The conversation then turns to the topic of Chinese influence in the United States, specifically in regards to property ownership. Bustamante explains that foreign nationals, including the Chinese, are able to buy American property due to our legal system, and while it is beneficial for the economy, the US has the power to take ownership away from foreign nationals if necessary. However, it is unclear whether they own more farmland in the US than any one person or business entity. The discussion concludes with the idea that while it is important for foreign nationals to be able to buy American property, the US has the power to protect its property rights. The Chinese middle class is growing, and with their focus on manufacturing and technological advancements, they are not investing in the military-industrial complex like the US did in the global war on terror. Instead, they are investing in US real estate, which provides legal protections for their investments. This has led to the ownership of significant portions of US farmland, industrial properties, and mineral mines by Chinese companies. The US allowed this to happen due to its policies that allow businesses to be viewed as individuals with their rights and protections. However, the Chinese who can afford to invest in US real estate is a wealthy subsector of their society. It is not incentivized by the Chinese government but rather by individuals who want to protect and grow their capital. Bustamante suggests that the US should limit investments in its economy to only American citizens and vetted individuals. However, he acknowledges that the US is too punch-drunk on wealth to make necessary policy changes quickly. Check out the full podcast by clicking the link in the description below. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for listening to this podcast summary episode of the Pod Slice.